Anyway, díomh go léir card gael agus fáilte an seo. I'm really delighted and really looking forward to this talk tonight. I don't know Joe personally, but I'm sure we've met before. And particularly at that wonderful celebration in 2017 on the North Wall, where the plaques were erected to the SS Hare and Adela, the men who were lost in those two sinkings. And I had a particular interest in it myself because a distant cousin was Joe Swords, one of the men, you know. So that was a wonderful event. And of course, Joe was part and parcel of that and the driving force behind it to a great extent, I'm told. But he's also a member of the East Wall History Group and a community activist, which must take up an awful lot of his time. And apart from that, he is a coordinator of the Sean O'Casey Festival. And in 2019, he was the executive producer of the documentary When Hitchcock Met O'Casey, which I haven't seen, but sounds fascinating. I've always liked O'Casey stuff. I remember going to the Abbey to see it when I was very small. But he is a historian of the Dublin port and docks and the inner city, all of which I personally find fascinating, but very difficult to pin down some of the stuff in it. So hopefully we'll get a lot more information about it tonight from Joe. So to talk about this intriguing title about the schoolboys strike, I don't know, I will have to let Joe tell us all about that himself. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Joe Mooney. You're very welcome to address us tonight, Joe. Thank you.
Okay. On this day 110 years ago, pupils at the East Wall Boys School were in the middle of a strike. And when I say middle of a strike, I mean that literally, because the strike began on Wednesday, the 13th of September. It continued through Thursday, the 14th of September, which is today's date, and one more day, Friday, the 15th. And then by Monday, it was all over. Hit the weekend, and by Monday, the strike was all over. Now, it lasted only 3 days. It was treated largely as a comedy event by the newspapers of the day. So it is a good question. Why is it worth remembering? Now, from our point of view in the community, it's a noteworthy event in the history of our school and community. But in the grand scheme of things, did it really matter? It was a decade that saw incredible upheaval and social agitation in the country. We had the Dublin lockout in 1913. We had the Easter Rising in 1916. And then we had the War of Independence in 1919 to 21. So you'd have to ask, what did a 3-day schoolboy strike matter? Well, yeah, on a comparative scale, it didn't really matter. I suppose it's a quirky story, but if you look at it in the context of those events I've just talked about and the growing tensions, it fits in right into the middle of those events, and I'll explain that as I go on. So in terms of sources that I'm going to use, that we've used to put the story together and I'm going to use to tell the story, in 2011, as we approached the centenary of the strike, myself, Katrina Cassidy, and the late Sarah Lundberg tried to put the meat on the bones of the story that we had heard word of mouth. So the extent of our knowledge really came from this booklet here. This was the East Wall Community Festival in 1975. And a man called Kevin Bourne, who some people may remember was very much part of the Save Wood Quay campaign in the 1970s. He wrote an article in this magazine about his father's recollections of the strike. That was pretty much all we knew and a few other rumblings. So we set out in a race against time to get the story together for the centenary. So we found newspaper reports, which one I'll read later on, which was very useful. In the National Archives, we found school inspectors' reports. We had access to the school's own records, which so far aren't digitalized and aren't available to the public. We got some material off the Sisters of Charity in Seville Place, who were part of running the school. And then we got local folk memory. Then once we started looking, a few more stories came out. And then in putting together the broader context, probably the most useful item was the Bureau of Military History. So I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to give a bit of context for the Docklands community. I'm going to give the context of the school, a little bit of history of the school, a bit of context of the events that were going on around that time, and then move on to the strike. I'm going to use a few pictures of school children in this, and they are children from the East Wall Boys School and the Girls School, but they're not from 1911. I've tried to use the earliest ones that we have that have been donated to us, but just so I don't mislead anyone, they're not actually 1911, unfortunately. Okay, the very basic facts of any story about the Docklands, the North Docklands, has to begin with the fact is that it was all reclaimed land. This map is, I think it's 1686. And you can see here's the city here. Here's Ballybock here, Clontarf Island, which is long gone. This is Clontarf here, and this is a wide open bay. What happens is Captain Bligh or Admiral Bligh carries out a survey of the bay, discovers there's loads of sandbanks that create difficulties of opening up a channel here, and the south wall is built. Then the north wall is built, and then the east wall is built. The north wall corrals, the south wall and the north wall help corral the Liffey, and the east wall, which is probably roughly about here, corrals the Tolka. So now that the land the walls have been built, somebody realizes what a great idea is to fill in the bits in between. So you have just off screen here, you have north wall and you have east wall here, and then this is the Tolka here. So all the land from the North Strand down to what would be Fairview now, and over to the right, the north wall is reclaimed. And this is the plan for the area. This is the early 1700s. This land now will be reclaimed later on, and that's Fairview Park, the Port Tunnel, etc. East Point is all there now. So this is the original plan for East Wall, and this is what it gets. This is probably the late 1800s. This is what we now know as the East Wall Road or the Wharf Road. This is the North Strand, but significantly the railway has come along and it cuts us off from the rest of the North Wall here. And the school hasn't been built in this picture. That's how we know it's between the late 1880s and the 1890s. The school is roughly about here. And as I said, all this land has since been filled in. So with the creation of this land here, with the building of the walls, Dublin Port can develop. And then Paula will recognize this ship here. This is the Adela here. This is taken from John Rogerson's quay on the south side. And you're looking over to the north side of the North Docks, and you can see all the way down is ships, all the way down this side is ships. And what people often forget is that every bit of wall from the custom house right down out into the port was active, was busy. It's hard to imagine that now, but everywhere along the way there was carters, there was sheds, there was ships landing, there was warehouses and various companies. So this is the context of Dublin Port as we came into the early 20th century. Thousands of people working here, many of them living within the local communities. Now, I'm just going to jump back a little bit in time. In the 1840s, with the development of the port, with the arrival of the railway, with the increase in industry in the area, and also as a side effect of the famine, the population shot up. So they discovered there was a need to build a church here to look after the spiritual needs of the community. And as you can see here, this is, we actually have an original of this, which was an incredible find. It says the population is between 3,000 and 4,000 souls, and it lists the kind of jobs that were in the area and decide there's a need to build a church. And this church is built then, opens, I think it's 1848, and that would be St. Lawrence O'Toole's, which still stands there. It's Sheriff Street here, Seville Place. Now, to go along with the church is the schools, which are built along here, which would be an infant school, a boys' school, and a girls' school. So that's on Seville Place, Sheriff Street. Again, I'm just showing this for a couple of seconds. This is actually a census of the Catholic population of the area, which would be of great interest to people in your society. This is a census of the Catholic population of the area carried out by the new parish priest round about 1848. So it's not digitalized, and it's not largely available to the public, but there is access, and if people are interested, I can talk to them about it. Okay. As the area fills up, the church was built in 1848, the schools are built. East Wall, the other side of the railway, starts to develop in the late 1800s, starts to populate more, and they realised there's the need for a new school to accommodate the growing population. And this here is the East Wall Road. If you know the East Wall Road and know the current school, St. Joseph's Co-ed, this is the same location. This is the Wharf School. There's an infant school at the back, which you can't see from here. There's a boys' school to the right, and there's a girls' school to the left. Now, the school opens in 1895, and then in 1898, the infant school is opened behind it. The parish priest of St. Laurel's O'Toole, Father Brady, would be the school manager for the years to come, but he asked the Sisters of Charity to get involved, and they work in the infant school and the girls' school, and there's male staff for the boys' school. I just thrown this in to give a little bit of context of the area at the time. The school is just about up here. This is the East Wall Road here. This is the Merchants Warehousing Company, and you're looking out into probably Fairview, Clontarf, and all the way along, and you can see it's all water here. What exists there now as part of Dublin Port, the Port Tunnel, the East Point Business Park, none of it has been built yet. I think it's a great picture there. We got that out of an original records book owned by the Merchants Warehousing Company. Extraordinary pictures of the area from the time. And again, I'm just showing this. It's not really relevant to the story, but this is from the school archives. This is a record of all the teachers who were in the girls' school, starting from 1896 onwards up to the 1920s. And again, it's a really interesting piece of material. Now, I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of the school. As I said, they're not from 1911, but I know people love pictures of that era. So this is the infant school. We're not probably the 20s or the 30s. We're not entirely sure, but this is the infant school. And incredible as this may seem, this is a full class. This is the girls' school, probably a little bit later, judging by the clothes. And this is the boys. I'm not quite sure of the date, but again, that's probably a full class. And you can see this kid, for some reason, has one shoe. This one probably only has one shoe as well. But this is, again, believe it or not, this is probably a full class. This is probably one class. Okay, now moving on to the bones of the story. The earliest photograph we have of the East Wall schoolboys is from 1898 from the confirmation class. This is the school principal, John Francis Holman. The picture is taken at the back of St. Lawrence O'Toole's church. So this is the principal, John Francis Holman, and all these kids will have left the school, obviously, by the time the strike comes along. Okay. The first principal of the school is John Francis Holman. He joins the school in 1895 when it opens, and he remains principal of it until 1926, 30 years. Originally from Cork, his previous assignment had been in a private school in Kilkenny. So it's probably obvious that when he comes to the rough and rowdy schoolboys of the Docklands area, it's going to be a bit of a challenge for him. He lives in this house here, which is just off camera, unfortunately, but this is the Wharf Tavern. At the time, it was known as the Seabank House. It then became the Wharf Tavern, and once again, if you know the area, it's the Seabank House again. The house here was owned by the Cabinet family who owned the pub, and he was a boarder there. It was literally 30 seconds walk from the school. The pub's number is 21 to 22, and if you walk up to here, you skip the house here, and 24 and 25 is the school. He gets married in the early part of the 20th century, and then by 1911, he's married and living in Clontarf. He was 40 years old when he gets married. Now, some of the documentation we have seen suggests that while he may have been a passionate educator, his leadership and administration skills were certainly not of the finest. I'm just going to give a few examples from school inspectors' reports we read. In 1903, it says, the manager was requested to admonish Mr. Holman for the impropriety of tone adopted in his letter explanatory of his late attendance. And again in 1983, at a different date, Mr. Holman is reprimanded on repeated irregularity in attendance. And in 1908 again, Mr. Holman did not arrive until 10 o'clock and would give no explanation as to the cause of his lateness. The manager's attention has been drawn to this by the inspector. And this goes on. In 1905, he makes an incredible voyage. A school inspector's report of the time, it notes an extensive and unaccounted absence during the period. Now, when we found this, we assumed he might have had health problems, maybe mental health problems, maybe a drink problem. But more incredibly, he goes to Japan. He just ups and goes to Japan. But while the Russian-Japanese war is on, this guy with a big beard arrives there. He's mistaken for a spy for some time. And he studies the Japanese education system and ends up in Japanese newspapers as a leading Irish educationalist. And then, even though his absence is unexplained and unpermitted, he comes back and writes all about it. And it's an incredible account, which I'd love to talk about, but I better move on. At the time of the strike, he's the principal of the school, as I said. He's age 50, and his three teachers are Charles McCarthy, age 39, John O'Sullivan, age 37, and the youngest is John Rowan, age 21, who people may know as Sean Rowan, who was a senator from 1943 to 1957. Now, looking at the broader events in the Docklands community at this time, 1908, 1909, this man arrives, Big Jim Larkin. He's a Liverpool born. He's an absolute firebrand of an orator, and he founds the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in late 1908 and 1909. It's in the North Docklands where the union finds its greatest success, and by 1910, more than half the entire national membership is based in the Dublin number 1 branch, which covers the docks. In 1911, the union has a chance to flex its muscle. A lockout of Pearce's ironworkers in Wexford will end in victory for the union. And in August, a national rail strike will provide the opportunity to test their strength in Dublin. And then this all comes to a head in September. I think you kind of know where this is going. During the summer, there'd been transport strikes in Liverpool, and during August and September, dock strikes in London, Manchester, and Hull, mainly for better pay and conditions and working hours. So obviously, news of these events would be talking points in the sister Dockland community. Information travels well between ports. And then the rail dispute, the national rail dispute, will touch upon North Wall. And once this happens, putting the genie back in the bottle in Dublin is going to prove very, very difficult. Okay, the 18th of August, a national rail strike is called in Britain. However, the rail companies quickly negotiate a settlement and the strike ends very suddenly. But in Dublin, staff at the London and North Western Railway at North Wall have gone on strike. This quickly spreads to other rail depots, and very soon all class of rail workers, porters, signalmen, labourers are out, and this spreads to other counties. The rail workers are not members of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. They're members of other unions, but Larkin is invited to join their national strike committee, and he commits to sympathetic action in support of the rail workers. And this is what he says: we have to show to the employing class that the docker, the coal heaver, the railwayman, the sailor, and the fireman are all one class, and if one section is struck at, all the others will say, out we go. So, in support of the striking rail workers, loads of companies in the Docklands get caught up in the strike through sympathetic action and lockouts. Crow's Timber Yard, which is immediately adjacent to the school, it borders with the school, is involved. The Merchants Warehousing Company, right beside the school, is involved. And T&C Martins, one of the biggest employers in the area, are involved. So literally all these strikes break out around the school. When the UK strike ends very quickly, the men in these companies, the carters, the labourers, etc., decide to stay out and push for their own demands and better pay and conditions. And then the rail strike is over, but the rail workers in Ireland return the favour of sympathetic action to the other workers. And soon, a new rail strike has escalated in Ireland. And because of this, troops have to be deployed in Ireland. And these pictures here, this is troops on the North Wall Quay. You can see the sheds behind them and you can see a ship in front of them. And this is on the rail line on Sheriff Street. If you ever walk from Sheriff Street down towards Dublin Port, past Spencer Dock, you're going over the long bridge. This is just down that wall there. So troops have to be brought in to keep this situation under control. Now, luckily, they don't shoot anyone dead, which they have done in Llanelli in Wales back in August during the rail strike there. And then the boys in Llanelli, there's a lot of tension in the area, of course. They go on strike on the 5th of September, and soon strikes are reported all over England, Scotland, and Wales. And then on September the 13th, the East Wall schoolboys go on strike. This is from a commemoration we had 10 years ago on the centenary. And again, this is not East Wall schoolboys, but it's a very famous photograph. Now, the boys come out on strike. They have their own demands for what they want, but they clearly align themselves with the trade union movement. You can see here, ITSBU. So you have the Irish Transport General Workers Union, and this is clearly Irish Transport Schoolboys Union. So they knew what they were doing. Yes, that is how they spelled that. Any boy caught going into school and not following other schoolboys' examples will be killed by order. Strike, strike, strike. Now, there seemed to have been a little bit of a warning of this. We believe the boys met on the Monday evening in some fields in the area. And on Tuesday afternoon, according to the principal, John Francis Holman, later, he says, on Tuesday at playtime, 4 boys of the school stole away on strike, but one, though a ringleader, returned before play was over. So that happened on the Tuesday before the general strike begins. Now, what exactly happened in the school, what incidents, if any, that prompted them to go out on the days they did, we don't really know. But on September the 13th, Wednesday, the strike begins. And the boys were out bright and early and ready to go ahead with their strike. They had their demands, they had their plan, but they were also cautious, and it becomes clear they didn't really want to be identified individually, some of them, for their actions. So arriving at the school on the morning of what is this, sorry, I should say, in typical fashion, as per the inspector's reports, at least 3 of the teachers are late for the school on the day of the strike. So they don't actually see what happens at the beginning. And that's part of the problems in the school with Holman's leadership, it would seem. But arriving at the school in the morning, 2 threatening messages are found pinned to the door, both of which are lost to history, unfortunately. But the chalk message I read here is written down by teacher Charles McCarthy before he rubs it out. And the most comprehensive surviving account from any of the teachers is from John Rowan, and I'm going to just read his account, which was given to the inspectors afterwards. He said, on nearing that school today, about 100 yards from it, I noticed a crowd of 20 boys congregated there. On seeing me, the greater portion of this crowd rushed down East Road. On arrival at the school, I noticed that on the door were 2 threatening notices and another such notice printed with chalk on the door. Shortly afterwards, one of the boys who ran away came into the schoolyard. On perceiving me, he made for the gate again. I stood there before him and ordered him back. I understand he was one of the ringleaders. During the day, I had a few calls from parents saying that their children were prevented from coming to school through the interference of a crowd, some of which were schoolboys. The remainder of the day passed without any major disturbance, till alone at 2:45 when my attention was drawn to shouting outside. On looking out the window, I saw a crowd of 15 boys or more rushing past. One entered the playground and hurriedly called the others, but nothing, however, came of this. Towards 3 o'clock, a good number of parents came to escort their children home. Now, there are a number of newspaper reports on the event, and one of them says, a large number of boys assembled in the vicinity of the school about 9:30 and paraded the district carrying flags on which were shown their demands. The strikers sent out scouts in all directions to prevent any pupils entering the schools. The police arrived on the scene and were busily engaged watching the boys, who kept parading for a considerable time. And then another report says at 9 o'clock, they assembled on the East Wall Road and refused to allow other boys to go to school. Their demands for cheaper books and shorter hours were boldly chalked on flags which they carried. For some time, they marched about cheering and shouting and amusing themselves with such mischievousness as throwing cabbage stumps at doors. And then when the school broke up at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, a few policemen and many mothers were there to protect the good boys who had resisted all temptation to stray from the path of learning. Under female convoy, these boys reached their homes in safety and turned a deaf ear to the voice of the tempters who lurked in the side streets. So that's kind of paints a picture of what actually happened on the day. The kids turned up, they tried to turn away other kids, they threw stuff randomly, called other kids scabs, and tried to avoid teachers or the bobbies who turned up to get themselves into more trouble. But they had their demands written out. They'd left a message stating the strike. So it was very much in the tradition of what was going on elsewhere in the Docklands. But the most interesting account of what happened, and I'm going to read this at length, appeared in the Telegraph. I had the headline, "Shorter hours, cheaper books, no caning and weekly half holidays." That was the headline, and it boasted that it had an actual interview with the kids. So this is the best account that I've seen because it gives voice to the children who were involved. So this is the Telegraph reporter. A representative was observed by a number of boys leaving the school, and as he approached them, they scampered off in all directions. Then they took up position over 100 yards away and kept a sharp eye on our reporter, whom they evidently regarded as an enemy. Now, according to the reporter, I opened up negotiations with the strikers by sending them a message to the effect that I was not a school teacher, that I was only a reporter. The effect of the message was talismanic. All the boys swarmed about me like flies, clamoring to tell the story of the strike and the character of their demands. In all, there were about 14 children, ranging in ages from 8 to 13 years. They all wanted to talk together, but when I suggested that it would be more convenient if they spoke one at a time, they readily agreed and appointed the oldest boy, a bright-faced, intelligent-looking, sturdy young fellow, as spokesman. "What is the strike all about?" I asked. "Look here," replied their spokesman. "We want shorter hours. From 9 to 3 o'clock is too long, and we are kept in until 4 if we do anything wrong. We want the hours to be from 10 to 3. "No, no," replied a younger boy very decisively. "We want the hours to be from 10 to 2:30. "Very well," said the spokesman. "Put that down. From 10 to 2:30. We want to get cheaper books. 8 shillings and 6d, you know. It's too much for 5th class books." "That's right," interjected a woman who had joined the crowd. "The price of a book should be reduced to half. How can a poor man pay 2 shillings 6d for books out of £1 a week? In England, they get the books free. We don't want to be as bad as England, but we should get the books at half price." The spokesman then resumed his statement to claim, "We object," he said, "to the use of the rod entirely. The teachers are not supposed to use the cane at all, according to the rules. Boys should not be put down on their knees from one part of the day to another. That is not education, is it?" The question was not merely a rhetorical one. It was triumphantly levelled at me, and the speaker awaited a reply. I said I don't know much about education, and my audience readily concurred. "We want to get a half day on Wednesdays. These are our demands." "Yes," interjected another boy. "Put down that and say that if we don't get our demands, we won't go back. We will bring out all the boys again tomorrow and nail the boys who are at school this evening. We'll give every one of them 2 or 3 black eyes." That's my favourite bit. "We will give every one of them 2 or 3 black eyes." "How can you do that?" said another boy. "They only have 2 eyes each." The question was ignored by the militant striker, who continued, "God pity the youngsters this evening. Come down, mister, at 3 o'clock and see their elwins bringing them home under their aprons." "Hello," shouted one of the crowd. "Here's a big bobby coming down." And the audience quickly melted away with a parting message to me to give them a fair show. So that appeared in the Telegraph newspaper, and it's absolutely brilliant. It captures perfectly the atmosphere of the boys, how they're behaving, but it shows clearly they have very, very clear demands and they understand them. Their spelling wasn't great, as we saw on the sign, and maybe the biology wasn't great with the 3 eyes, but other than that, I think they come across very well. Now, that was the first day of the strike. The second day of the strike, this is the newspaper report. A number of the truants returned to school full of contrition, and the teachers then found out that only 26 boys were still absent. I'll discuss that again later. Many of the 26 were not included in the ranks of the strikers, for their mothers, thinking that the bad example might overcome their fear of parental wrath, had simply kept them out of harm's way within doors. Now, a reporter for the Evening Telegraph on that day noticed there were 2 policemen on duty in the vicinity of the school, but they told our representative there had been no trouble this morning. But something quite interesting. Sorry, I just can't see a bit of my print here. Something quite interesting is going on. The newspaper headline said, "Another day of comedy, school strike becomes a farce," stuff like that. But something really interesting is going on, and this time it's on the south of the Liffey at City Quay. Now, we've no records from City Quay to find out any report on it, but this is from the Freeman's Journal newspaper. He says, the Freeman's Journal representative made his way about noon on yesterday via Townsend Street to the scene of action at City Quay. He found the working class district as quiet as usual. A few women stood gossiping on the doorsteps. A solitary policeman moved about the street. The excellent City Quay National School betrayed no sign of a strike or lockout. Rather a lock-in, for I had to knock at the closed door to get admission. The good lady teachers could tell me little or nothing. All we know, they said in effect, is that there was some disturbance in the street about 10 o'clock this morning. In consequence of the noise, we believe, the police came and it was soon at an end. Some of the mothers were anxious about their little children and came inquiring after them. Others brought their children themselves to the school as they should suffer any harm, they said. So basically it sounds like nothing happened, but the newspaper man wants a story, so he goes off to find another source. The policeman at the street corner could not add much to the story. He was not on duty when the gang of young disturbers first appeared, but he was there soon afterwards. It appears, said he, that between 10 and 11 o'clock this morning, when some of the latecomers were arriving at the school, some dozen or perhaps 20 of the younger corner boy class formed up in the street, shouted scabs at them and threw a few stones. A colleague of mine was called to the scene, but before he arrived, the disturbers had cleared away. No one was injured by the stones. The school was in no way damaged or even struck, and one of the teachers who came out was not molested. So he's starting to get a bit more of the story, and he goes a bit further. One of the good ladies engaged in passing the time of day with a neighbour was able to add something more interesting. The young blackguards, she exclaimed indignantly. There were the poor children going to school, and they came up the street and tried to prevent them. They'd better not come up here again, or they'll get what they did not expect. What happened at all? I asked. What do you think would happen? Would any mother let an idle young scamp interfere with her child in the street? Why, we all turned out and beat them away, and they may well avoid these parts in future. Now, when you hear those reports, it doesn't sound like much. And like I said, the headline, City Schoolboys Strike Proves a Fiasco. City Schoolboys, a second act of comedy. But you think of the syndicalist trade union message, an injury to one is an injury to all, and the principle of sympathetic strikes. The boys have already identified themselves as similar to the Transport General Workers Union. And one of the teachers writes about the boys afterwards that he had heard, it was rumoured that they were to use their influence also to prevent children from going to other schools in the vicinity. None of the strikers were visible in the immediate neighbourhood of this school, meaning they'd gone somewhere else. Now, if you read between the lines on those reports, you can see that the teachers didn't recognise the boys outside the school. The other parents didn't recognise the boys outside the school. So it's probably because they weren't from the area. And then, if you think back, there was no bridges along the Liffey in those days, other than the one at Butt Bridge, Custom House, Liberty Hall. So if the boys in East Wall are at their school at the time they're meant to be, they see the bobbies hanging around, they decide to walk to City Quay. That tallies entirely with the time they were meant to be at City Quay. So it's very much our belief from what we've read is that the boys from East Wall were the ones at City Quay trying to bring another school out. The perfect all-out tactic. And then that's the second day. So moving on to the last day of the strike, Friday, there's no newspaper reports that we found. There's no records from any other school. So it's a good time to discuss the numbers involved. Now, the newspaper says 26 kids were out, not all strikers. And they got this from the principal, John Francis Holman. My apologies. That's clearly a lie. The principal states elsewhere that the average daily attendance is 140 pupils. Looking at the records, and this is bore out again by the inspector's reports afterwards, on the 12th of September, the day before the strike, there was 166 pupils in the school, in the boys' school. On the day of the strike, the 13th of September, there's 80 boys in the school. On the second day of the strike, the 14th of September, there's 77 boys in the school. And on the final day of the strike, the Friday, there's 82 boys in the school. So despite what is portrayed, there's less than half of the boys are in school for the 3 days of the strike. So that's just worth noting. But whatever happens over the weekend and wherever pressure is brought to bear, by Monday, the strike appears to be over and the boys are back in school. There's an investigation into the strike. The school inspectors will investigate, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the perpetrators have to be punished. And this rather gruesome note was written on the 22nd of September by John Francis Holman, and he describes how he dealt with what he describes as the ringleaders. I won't elaborate on who were the ringleaders and his opinion, but from the reports we've read, they're very contradictory. Other teachers contradict his report. The school manager contradicts him, and he seems to be playing a bit of a blame game, trying to blame kids who are no longer in the school, when clearly the strikers came from the school. But this is the punishment that was meted out, and it's blood-curdling to read. After rigorous inquiry, I selected 3 of the worst and biggest, 2 pupils and 1 ex-pupil. I took down a drill staff from the rack, got a tough cane from a neighbour, sent out for the heroes' parents, calmly recited their exploits, placed the staff and cane at their parents' disposal. The whacks, the howls, the lashes, the screams, the smashing of the staff, the wheels of the cane, the angry shouts of the parents, the piteous cries for mercy produced an impression on the upturned, hushed, pale faces of the 150 boys to whom punishment in school was so new. At a signal from me, the execution stopped. So really grim punishment for the children that he singled out. Now, there is an inspector's, the school is visited regularly by a inspector called, I can't remember his first name, Mr. Bateman, but a senior inspector is brought in to investigate the strike and the events around it. So I'm just going to pick out a few highlights from their report. In relation to the price of books, the school manager writes of Principal Holman's practice of refusing admission to pupils without money for the books. And he says this has been brought to his attention by the parents, and he has complained to Holman about this. Holman admits to the school inspector that he delays admission if book money was not forthcoming. Now, no official action is recommended against Holman on this, but the school inspector brings this to the attention of the manager and says he wants attention drawn to the list of books and materials the senior boys are required to purchase. So quite clearly, he sees a merit in the demand for reduced price of the books, that the books are too dear for the families to afford. In relation to the use of the cane, there's a huge conflict over the accusations here. Principal Holman says this has been banished in the school. This has been forbidden in the school for a number of years. But then he also goes on to say that Charles McCarthy objected to it being banned, and he can only control the class by the use of a cane. The claims are contradicted by the regular school inspector and also by the school manager, the parish priest. So we don't really get to the bottom of whether corporal punishment was being carried out in the school or not. There's so many contradictory claims that it's never actually realized. But the other issue that the boys mentioned was the issue of being forced to kneel down for long periods of time. And this is true. When Holman was in Japan, when he visited the schools there, looking like a Russian spy and being treated as an ambassador of the order schools, he saw the punishment that was being used there. And one of the punishments was children were taken out and forced to kneel down. And he started to replicate that in the East Wall School. So whatever the merit of having children in Japan kneeling on the floor in a school, in a cold school building with stone floors, right as you saw from the pictures, opposite the sea, and leaving them kneeling on that floor for periods of time was not acceptable. And this was noted again by the inspectors. Now, overall, in correspondence related to the investigation, there's no serious action recommended other than it said this should be paid attention to, this isn't quite right. But the boys were victorious to a certain degree in even getting this noted, but also, and this is a story for another day, the school came under scrutiny for many years ahead. It was clear that there was a conflict between the principal, the manager, and some of the teachers. And this would continue on to the 1920s. And a close eye was kept on this. So the boys certainly achieved something in bringing this attention onto their school. Now, other than their demands, their actions of acting and describing themselves, acting like and describing themselves as a trade union is worth investigating. And this wasn't lost on the inspectors or the school manager. In the report on the strike, the school inspector says he blames what he calls it's the contagion of being exposed to, from morning to night, talk about strikes. And the school manager supports this. He says, strikes were in the air at the time, and the residential quarters of the general strikers were all around the school. And that's true. As I mentioned earlier, some of the places out on strike where Crow's was right next to the school. Crow's workers get involved in a shootout in Sheriff Street right opposite the church, and they get called scabs when they're moving a horse and cart around, and one of them produces a revolver and fires shots. So all these stories are going around the area, so that's certainly true that the boys are right smack bang in the middle of the industrial unrest. Now, the boys were clearly influenced by the events going on around them up to that period, but how did it influence the boys in what happened afterwards? We're moving into a revolutionary period. So did their moment of radicalism in 1911 as strikers influence the rest of their lives? And I think it clearly did. So I'm going to briefly describe the subsequent actions of 3 of the 1911 pupils, and we can see where they fit into the flow of Irish history. I've picked one from the 1916 Rising, one from the War of Independence, and one from a latter period. So moving on, just putting that picture up very, very quickly. This is from 1913. This is Merchants Road in East Wall. And these entire road, 62 workers and their families were evicted during the 1913 lockout. And I just put up that picture because it's such a powerful picture, and it does tie into what I'm going to cover next. Okay, Bernard Courtney. Bernard Courtney is a pupil in the school from 1908 onwards, and he's there in 1911. This is from the school records, and you can see Bernard Courtney's name here. You can also see other names here, but Joseph O'Doherty's brother was severely injured in the 1916 Rising in the Stephen's Green garrison. Bernard Courtney lives in number 1 Merchants Road, which is right down at the end here. In 1908, the Merchants Warehousing Company built houses for which they rented to their staff. The road, Merchants Road, gets the nickname Compulsory Avenue because they forced their workers to move in and pay them rent. After 1913, it will have a new nickname, Scabs Row. The first residents on the road are the Courtney family, and this here is Daniel Courtney, the father of Bernard Courtney. During the 1911 strike wave, the Merchants Warehousing Company are one of the companies which concedes the workers' demands, and this includes Daniel Courtney. In 1913, the company gets their revenge. They lock out their workers who won't denounce the union and evict, as I said, 62 families. Unfortunately, we don't have a better quality picture of this, but this, as you can see, is a family carrying their belongings up the road, heading towards the Eastwall Road, and the school will be just around the corner. As an IKGWU member, Daniel would go on to join the Citizen Army in 1913, and in 1916, both Daniel and his son Bernard, who, I'm doing some quick maths here, would be 17 at the time, take part in the Rising. Both survived the Rising, but the following year, Bernard dies from TB, which in that era would kill more Dublin working class people than any amount of British bullets would have done. His funeral from St. Lawrence O'Toole's Church is massive. It gets huge Republican and trade union support. It leaves the church and marches around to 1916 garrisons before making its way to Glasnevin Cemetery. And it was one of the first showcase funerals of the post-1916 era as we moved on through 1917 towards the War of Independence. This here is Edward Dorans. Edward Dorans was a pupil in the school from 1908, and he dies in 1921. You can see his name on the bottom here. And again, you can see this is register from the schoolboys register. The Dorans family moved to Church Road in Eastwall from Kingstown, now Dunleary. And Edward, after school, he started in the school in 1908, and afterwards he would work in the Dublin Dockyard Company. He would join the 2nd Battalion of the IRA in, I think, 1917 or 1918, and would fight in the War of Independence. In February of 1921, he was taken from his home by Crown forces, taken away in a lorry and badly beaten as they drove him to the forecourts, or the area around the forecourts. At gunpoint, he was forced to jump into the River Liffey, but managed to swim as far as the custom house and climb out and make his way to hospital. While in hospital, he gets a warning that the British are coming to get him, and he managed to escape and gets back to Eastwall. On the 25th of May, he was one of the 5 IRA volunteers who died in combat during the burning of the custom house, and his funeral was also from St. Lawrence O'Toole's. In fact, there was discussions in the 70s, I think it was, to name the road in front of here after Edward Dorans, but that never happened. Sorry, the road at the side here, Memorial Road. It was the discussion of naming it after Edward Dorans. Jumping forward again, this is Johnalty, a pupil in the school from 1908. He would die in 1938. This is his brother Stephen, who fought in World War I, and this is his brother Mick, who also would work in the Dublin Dockyard like Edward Dorans had, and then would sail the world afterwards. The Nalty family came from Galway, and Jack Nalty, or John, or Jack as he was known, had at least 2 sisters who would be pupils in the girls' school on the Eastwall Road. He joined the IRA and fought in the War of Independence and the Civil War on the anti-treaty side. He was a staunch trade unionist and would become shop steward for hundreds of oil workers based in Dublin docks. He was also a champion runner, and it can be seen here with the Dublin Harriers, and would represent Ireland internationally in a successful cross-country tournament. In 1936, he volunteered for the International Brigades to fight against the fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War, and died on the brigade's last day of combat in the Battle of Jarama in September of 1938. If you're familiar with this is him in his uniform in Spain. If you're familiar with the Christy Moore song, Viva la Quinta Brigada, when they list the names to be remembered, Jack Nalty is one of them. So I think it's hard not to imagine that the radicalism they got involved with in school, or they witnessed in school, didn't somehow influence in their life, in their later life. These are just three of the pupils from that era, from that year of the strike, that went on to continue their political or radical activity, whichever way you want to look at it, or whichever way you want to describe it. Now, John Francis Holman, I'll talk about what he done afterwards. And he also had his moments where he was involved in the great wave of Irish history that was to come. As a St. John's ambulance driver, he was involved in the Easter Rising. He was on duty in the O'Connell Street area. And as you can see over here, he was one of the people that received accommodation for his work during the 1916 Rising. He would also be a volunteer ambulance driver on O'Connell Street again in 1922 at the outbreak of the Civil War, or what was known as the Battle of Dublin. Ironically, pupils from the school that he would have seen through the school years were involved in fighting on both sides on O'Connell Street in that terrible period. And there's an incredible story about John Francis Holman during that era, which we're going to tell next year. You'll have to come back for that one if you want to know it. He retired from the school in 1926, as it says here, after 51 years of service. Though there might be controversy about him, though some of the pupils may have issues with him. The year after that he retired in 1927, there's a school reunion, and he is a major guest at it. He retired in 1960, as I said, and he would go on to become a prominent organiser with the Cumann na Gael political party in North Dublin. Now, I'm just going to wrap up. I think I've covered everything. I hope I've covered everything. This again, as I said earlier, this was a commemoration we had for the strike with pupils on the centenary year. In wrapping up, I think it's appropriate to dedicate tonight's talk, I think, to the memory of the boys who took part in the strike, and particularly the three boys who are identified by Kevin Byrne as among the ringleaders. We're not 100% sure. We've looked, we found them in the census, etc. We're not sure if these are the boys that were punished, but these were named by Kevin Byrne's father, who was 8 years old as a participant in the strike. And he named the boys as Joe Cooney, Mickey O'Brien, and Will O'More. So I think we should remember them tonight, because if nothing else, they've left us with a really great story to tell. And then as a final word, this is a picture taken at the front of the school. The girls' school, or sorry, the school which we saw in the pictures earlier was demolished, and a new school opened in 1961. It became a co-ed school under the management of this man, Seamus Murphy, who is sadly deceased. The vice principal for many years was Nora Duffy, and of course, this is Katrina Crowe from the National Archives. This was the launch of Paradise Alley, I think in 2012. This is myself. Why I am wearing runners and a black shirt, I don't know. Worse than some of the kids in the school picture. This is Katrina Cassidy from the East Wall History Group. And this is the late Sarah Lundberg from the East Wall History Group. I thought it was important to put those pictures. As I mentioned, I might have done the talk tonight, but Katrina and Sarah were very much involved in gathering the information for this story. Sarah sadly passed away in 2014, but her knowledge as a historian and as an archivist really took myself and Katrina out of the dark and put us on the right track to finding this story. Her knowledge of how to work archives really found material we probably never would have found. And if Sarah was alive today, I think she probably would have been the one doing this talk rather than me. So again, thanks for listening. I don't have a clock in front of me. I'm not sure if I went over time, but thanks for listening. And I hope I covered the story well. And I'm happy to take any questions here. Thank you.